Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. Just as a reminder, down at the bottom of your screen, please submit your questions using the Q&A button in that field. Questions that get typed into the chat oftentimes are missed, so please make sure that you use the Q&A area to submit your question. Should be down at the bottom of your screen. We'll go ahead and get started in a couple minutes as everybody filters in.
Neil, I'm thinking we'll do most of the questions at the end unless we see something that seems one of us notices something we can integrate in the flow.
Yep, makes sense.
William, the answer to your question is yes. Can I answer that one now? It will be recorded. And SFAR has been doing a great job sending those out in an email link also. So they'll be on the website, but usually when they're posted, they'll send it out as a standalone.
Marcia, I might have to disappear for 30 seconds during the presentation, not to unnerve you, but
okay.
I'll flip my camera off and then come back right away.
Sure.
All right, we'll give everybody about 60 more seconds and then we'll get started. All right, let's do it.
All right. Hi, guys. Welcome back for part 2.
So much has changed in the last 2 weeks. We got a new set of forms and then another set of revisions of those forms all in 2 weeks. So I'm sure everyone is feeling a little bit of coronavirus showing forms and advisory fatigue. Certainly, I think Marcia and I can sympathize with that. But we're glad that you're here, and we'll be going over the most recent revision of CAR forms specifically for showings during the shelter in place and the safer at home period that we're still in.
And I would encourage, if you weren't at the first session, it was recorded and we spend a little bit more time on some of the other logistical pieces. So we're not going to repeat all of that this time because we know we probably have a lot of the same people. But if you missed that, go back and watch at least the first half of that session because I think you'll find that helpful in tandem with this.
Yeah, and just as a friendly reminder, please do use the Q&A option down at the bottom to submit your questions. KJ, I've picked up your question from the chat and I'll do my best to make sure that we pick it up, but it's much easier for us to catch questions than as we're going through if they're in the Q&A section, please.
All right, let's get started. How to show property during COVID-19, part 2. We have a few things that have not changed, so we're going to hit those first. San Francisco, still virtual first. I know there's been a lot of showings going on. We're all out in the field. We know properties, especially vacant properties, are often open to show. highly, highly recommend, based on city requirements, that you discuss all of the virtual materials with your clients first, before even considering showing a property. So that's still those are still the rules. No printed materials at the property. This includes the PEAD. I know people conveniently were forgetting that one, and keeping some PEAD forms at the property. Unfortunately, that's against the rules, because statewide requirements and OSHA say no paper documents. So
That's right.
send those through DocuSign. Oh, go ahead, Neil.
I was going to say, digital signing, but that also includes disclosure packages, pest reports, brochures, magazines, anything that you might usually have at your open houses. Really, no paper to be present in the property, if at all possible.
There is one exception to that I will say: you should have the rules posted. We'll get to that later on the door.
Touche. Touche.
Sorry to have to clarify. You should have that posted, and recommend laminating that if possible, right? So you can wipe it down. Not a bad idea potentially, when you're doing your cleanup after showing. And then the third point is no open houses or broker tours yet. And I know we've been seeing upcoming plans for the city, and we'll get to that in a minute, that reference the term open houses, and we'll talk about what that really means. And it was very confusing, and I'll be honest, a lot of news outlets reported it in a very unclear way, and I think that created a lot of broad discussion. So we'll hit that later. And so not a lot has changed on these fronts. Little reminder of what virtual first is. Neil, you want to take us through this?
Yeah, so think of this as an opportunity to really super qualify your buyer for the property. In advance of physically going to see the property, if it is all possible, have them review all of the marketing materials, virtually of course, disclosures and reports that might be really important in their decision-making process. If there's any way to disqualify a property from a buyer's search that can be achieved by reviewing the information that's available, by all means do so. By reducing the need to go and see property that they're not going to submit an offer on, you save time both for yourself and for them, and you reduce the likelihood of somebody coming into contact with COVID-19. Additionally, you'd want to have those conversations about pricing. If it's something that they're not going to be able to afford, get their arms around that. Also, make sure that they've had the necessary conversations with their lenders. A lot has changed in the last 3 months. The ability of people to qualify, even if they have a pre-qualification or a loan pre-approval letter from before shelter in place, doesn't mean that they're going to still qualify for the same purchase amount or the same loan amount. There have been some significant changes, and I'm sure all of us are coming into that. And then, the other costs that go along with the purchase. So, homeowners insurance, or if they're contemplating doing work, if this is going to be beyond the scope of what they can handle or afford, and that can disqualify the property. That is a great way to disqualify the property and keep them safe. And then lastly, they can, in their own car, go and drive around the neighborhood, drive by the property. There's a remarkable amount of information that can be ascertained by being in physical proximity to the property without actually going in. And if that is something that they can use to disqualify the property, doesn't have the right view, it's on a hill, it's at the bottom of a hill, those sorts of things that they might be nervous about, by all means do that in order to help your buyer clients make decisions. The good news is, once you've done these steps, if they're still interested in going to see the property and it's feasible for that to happen, then you've already gone a long way towards making sure that this is going to be a property that you're likely to put an offer on.
And I just want to second that by saying, I've been having a lot of conversations with agents who say, I want to show property because it builds relationships with my clients. And there are different ways to build these relationships. And when you're having detailed conversations and demonstrating your knowledge of the market and properties, that builds relationships too. So thinking about this from a slightly different perspective, yes, we all love touring with our clients for an entire afternoon historically and being in the car with them and building that relationship, but that's just not possible right now. So different ways to build these relationships, and certainly people appreciate your knowledge and expertise. So this is an opportunity to shine.
Agreed.
All right, now we're getting to what's new. We've got updated state and local, which we'll hit really quickly. The new forms, which we are going to focus on quite a bit because I know there have been a number of questions. CAR actually put out versions of forms and then subsequently updated them very, very quickly. So we're going to just acknowledge what those updates were and use the most current versions, and then go through the new pictogram, which I'm sure people are seeing out there and on MLS. All right, little reminder. We work in San Francisco if we're on this call, most of us. And that means we have to follow both state guidelines and San Francisco specific guidelines. So not surprisingly, San Francisco is more stringent. So we've got our state guidelines, which includes the OSHA orders, which I'm sure now people have reviewed. They've been out circulating for weeks and weeks. We're not going to go through those in super detail, but we will hit on some of the highlights. And then also the governor's stay-at-home order, which is reflected in the CAR statewide documents. So we've got these statewide documents that are a little bit more broad. And then we've got San Francisco that hones in on a couple line items that are more specific and require more stringent activity. And the biggest one there is, we hit on this earlier, viewings are supposed to still be happening virtually. Showings should not be the first stop. So again, go through that long list. If the property is available to be shown, and not everything is going to be showable today, there may be reasons, you know, the listing agent says this property cannot be shown. We're taking a different approach. Please, if your client's interested, write an offer with some sort of contingency to come into the property, and we'll figure out logistics that are safe for everyone. Showings that do happen by appointment only, no open houses. So San Francisco put out this tentative reopening guideline, and it was, I thought, a little misleading. And perhaps the term open house was used. And in our industry, what we tend to think of with an open house is an open house where people from the public can come and walk in off the street. And certainly we talk to new prospective clients and pick up leads. What the order actually said may happen if the city is in a place where they can enact this prospective plan, there would be open houses with appointments. So my interpretation, and it sounds like the broad interpretation as I've been discussing with people at SFAR, is that essentially means a showing, a scheduled showing. There may be an opportunity there when that comes into play to do blocked showings. I know some people are doing more of that now, just from a listing agent perspective. That's a little bit more logistically palatable. So, you know, if you decide you want to work from noon to 4, then you do your best to schedule showings in sequence, so you then can go to be at the property outside, disinfect, have a showing, leave the property for that next showing, and then just try to time block. But those changes that they're saying might happen on July 13th, it's really not going to be a huge practical change from where we're at today.
Agreed. And again, we're about to get into the forms in just a second, but I want to make sure that everyone understands the BPP, the PEAD, the different disclosures that are being put out by CAR are designed for statewide use. And it is incumbent upon the local practitioner to be aware of what the local limitations are. And I think Marcia's done a pretty good job of summing up some of the concerns. And obviously there is a little bit of confusion out there about what an open house is or what broker's tour is today. I've seen quite a bit of advertising where people are advertising a broker's tour. And, you know, I'm sure that the people that are creating that advertising, those e-blasts, understand it has to be by appointment, and that it is they have to follow the appropriate protocol. But some practitioners are just going to see those emails and assume they can host an open house. They can host a broker's tour with people just showing up. And you cannot. You will be violating public policy if you do that. You're going to be endangering people if you do that. So please make sure that you understand what the local limitations are. They are still by appointment, where the occupant is not present, and not more than 2 individuals from the same household plus the agent, plus an agent, in the property at a time. And the listing agent or somebody else who's qualified to do so should be sanitizing surfaces in between visitors.
And Neil, just to piggyback on that point about the marketing piece, SFAR's official perspective on this, because before this session, we wanted to make sure we were able to communicate the SFAR's position based on their understanding of the laws, and the terms open houses and broker tours should not be used in marketing. That is SFAR's official position. There's just no need to put that language out there because it reads misleading. I understand that people want opens and clicks and things, but the reality is the city has actually been quite generous with the ability to even show a property with these restrictions. So let's respect that and not abuse for some sort of marketing clickbait situation. We all practitioners know the reality of what's going on right now. And so there's no need to use the language open house. There's no need to use the language broker tour. That's what SFAR's official position is. One other point, I know that the CAR guidelines were broader than this, so I'll mention it. San Francisco is still no more than 2 visitors and 1 agent. Those 2 visitors have to be from the same household or shelter in place subgroup. There's some other term they use, I'm drawing a blank, but it's household or Neil, do you know what the term is? I'm trying to remember.
I don't, it doesn't strike me off the top of my head, but the concept
we
is
all
2
know
people
the concept,
who
yes.
are in regular contact with each other physically in the same place.
Exactly. So that new viewing party or viewing group, that is not brought in now for San Francisco. We are still under 2 plus 1 agent. And I know some people had questions about the listing agent. I saw this on the Realtor Forum. The listing agent going into the property or being there at the same time. I would say talk to the listing agent before you go to the showing if you're the buyer's representative, and say, hey, how do we want to handle this? Who's going to be in the property? Because I know that there seems to be some confusion out there. I know listing agents want to be able to answer questions and, just open that dialogue. So figure out the best approach. If it makes the most sense for the listing agent to be in the property with the buyers, prospective buyers, and the buyer's agent to be outside or not in the property at the same time, that's okay. Figure it out beforehand, figure out what makes the most sense for the situation. All right. Okay, CAR BPPP. So many P's. So this is sort of the big document that came out that was new for everyone. So we're going to spend some time on it. This defines the requirements for each type of party, if we want to call it that. So we're going to go through visitors, we're going to go through sellers, we're going to go through agents. And we have some sort of bullet points. We do recommend you read this entire thing. It is now essentially attached to all of the other documents. So you're going to see it over and over. So I think it's 5 pages total. Spend the time to read it. We're going to hit sort of the highlights just to draw attention to a few things. But definitely it's important that you go through it line by line. So first, who are visitors? Visitors are prospective buyers, buyer's agents or broker, inspector or contractor, or pretty much anybody else coming to the property. So keep in mind, we as agents, we don't normally think of ourselves as part of a transaction because we aren't. But in this case, we are people, we're going to the property. We also have to fill out PEADs. We also have to think about exposure from ourselves and for ourselves. Neil, you want to take us through the the guidelines?
Absolutely. Yeah. So visitors it should be interpreted in the most overly broad sense possible. If it's a human being, whether they're an adult, a child, a contractor, a stager, somebody delivering food, they are somebody who could potentially be carrying COVID-19 or be exposed to it. And so they should be considered as part of this best practices, guidelines, and prevention plan. So the CAR BPPP, 3Ps, was had a very quick name change. So just so we're clear, it's the most current revision of the form. The title of this document is Mandatory Government Showing Requirements, including Best Practices, Guidelines, and Prevention Plan. And it asks that every visitor acknowledge the risk of visiting in person. They also agree to abide by the rules. So if you're dealing with an adult, which most of the people that are going to be coming to the property are, they can acknowledge their responsibility under the plan. But if you are dealing with a situation where they're bringing a minor, then consent has to be given by a parent or legal guardian for that minor. The plan and the PEAD-V for visitor or versatile, depending on which take you're taking on it, it should be delivered in advance of them arriving at the property. They should have adequate time to review that document, and preferably, if I was a listing agent, I would not be letting them go into the property, and we can talk about some ways for controlling access, until those documents have been, that document has been returned.
And just one side note on that, try to get it signed as close to the showing as makes sense is possible, because it is an active document that relates to people's medical conditions. So like if you have a showing at 3 p.m., get it signed that morning, send it to the listing agent at 9 in the morning. You don't want to send it 2 days in advance. That's not a great practice here. We're trying to keep it relatively close to the actual time of entry.
Yeah. And that's a perfect segue into one of the responsibilities of the visitors, which is to perform a home health screening for themselves. Do they have any of the symptoms that might suggest that they have COVID-19? Because if they do, they shouldn't go to the showing. That's a shocker, I know. And there are, obviously, the CDC guidelines are out there. They're referenced in these documents. You can refer to them, but you should be performing a home health screening as a potential visitor. And in addition to that, if you subsequently to the showing, start to manifest any of the symptoms, you have an obligation to inform the buyer's agent and the listing agent that has happened, so that appropriate steps can be taken, akin to the contact tracing that is getting a lot of news in the media lately. You have to wear PPE, right? So face masks are absolutely necessary. Gloves and booties are no longer required, but you can wear them if you have them. They should be handled appropriately. At the end of the showing, you will want to dispose of them and not transfer them between different properties. And those should be disposed of in an appropriate way. When you're inside of the property, you're agreeing to practice social distancing. And I think everyone knows what that is, but that is a minimum of 6 feet apart. Again, keeping in mind that no more than 3 people would be in the property at one time. Hand washing or hand sanitizing stations should be available at the property, and any visitor should be washing their hands just prior to entering and just prior to starting their tour of the property. And while they're inside of the property, they should avoid touching surfaces wherever possible.
And just a side note, because that language is a little confusing, then this is the official language: upon entry and upon touring. This might apply, for example, let's say you're going into an HOA, like a big building, right? So you'd sanitize going into the building, then when you get to the unit, you'd sanitize again. I think that could be an application here. If it's a single family home prior to entry, don't touch anything in between. And then the idea, of course, is that you always just want to make sure that there's no contact in between sanitizing before being in the property itself. And side note about HOAs, this is not explicitly covered here, but if you have a listing at an HOA or you're going and viewing an HOA type property with your clients, highly recommend there's some discussion with HOA on what the requirements are and everyone's clear on that. If you're going into a bigger building or some area that's communal.
Yeah, and just keep in mind that HOAs may have their own rules and regulations, not just about visiting and showing property, but also moving in and moving out can be a factor if you do get into contract or you're closing on one of those properties. So make sure that you're staying on top of that.
All right, now we're moving on to the sellers. So again, they're going to do an at-home, at-home screening. Same thing. If they have any symptoms, and side note, the symptoms are being updated by the CDC. So I know over the last month or two, they've added some symptoms. So for your own knowledge and just as a human being, I would suggest periodically taking a look at that. Cancel the showing if anyone who's occupying the property has symptoms. It's safer for everyone. Everyone wants to know that. And then of course, same as with the visitor form, if you end up having symptoms later, people do need to be notified for contact tracing. The seller's going to acknowledge the risk of having the visitor in their property, right, that they're occupying. They agree that they're going to review the RLA-CAA, which is that listing agreement amendment addendum that we will go through a little bit later. And then this is an item I know has come up for discussion a lot, which is who is responsible for cleaning. This form and the law specifically says that the seller's broker is responsible for cleaning using some approved mechanism. And this might include the buyer's agent, the seller's agent, the seller, or a designated cleaner who understands OSHA requirements and can comply and is over 18. So we'll get to this in a little bit when we go through the RLA-CAA about covering these costs and understanding that it is the listing broker's responsibility. I would just recommend, again, we're having these conversations as practitioners, so it's pretty explicit that that is the case, but if you're a buyer's agent, it doesn't mean you shouldn't be taking some additional precautions. I would not go out there and assume everything's being done by the listing agent, even though that's their responsibility. Let's all try to chip in and use best practices and not show up to property without PPE.
Agreed.
And the agents, that's us.
So again, a lot of things that are similar between the responsibilities of visitors under the BPP, and agents count as visitors. But additionally, we need to communicate electronically, and that includes obviously the forms that we're asking people to sign off, any marketing materials, provide hand sanitizer, sanitizing wipes, and face coverings for our clients. Verify that proper sanitation products are available for visitors prior to entry. And if they're not available, to advise visitors of that so that they can make an informed decision about whether they want to go into an unsafe environment potentially. We obviously have a responsibility to wash or sanitize our hands. Additionally, sanitizing handrails, knobs, those high-touch mobility or safety features that are likely to be touched in between visitors. And a question that comes up pretty frequently is, what if a visitor, presumably, is not willing to follow the plan and goes into the property? Well, you should give that person a warning. I don't suggest that you stop them physically, but I would certainly suggest that you give them a warning that they're not in compliance with the plan, and then report to the seller and their agent the fact that somebody was not in compliance and entered the building. And additionally, there should be disclosure to any subsequent visitors of the non-compliance of that individual. So again, they can decide for themselves if they want to proceed with their visit or reschedule or cancel their visit.
right. And we're not going to go through this line by line, but wanted to include a visual just so you know what we're talking about when you see this. You will see it attached, as I mentioned, to a lot of the forms. So this is the BPPP, and it's 5 pages, and it looks like that. And it used to have, the first iteration that came out used to have a signature line on the bottom. And just to mention, this is the more recent version. They took this broker signature off. This is a document that's referenced in all of the PEAD forms. It's referenced in the listing agreement amendment addendum. This form itself does not have any signatures on it. So you don't need to worry about that anymore. And then we have a nice new pictogram and rules for entry. Looks a lot like the one we have become familiar with the first round. Took a few things off. No longer has
gloves.
Gloves, yes, that is what was taken off. Still recommend if you have gloves and you want to wear them, not a bad idea. SFAR was saying, you know, gloves and booties may not be required in the city, but again, not a bad idea if used properly and disposed of properly. So let's remember, we're going to be posting this on MLS so everyone understands the rules for entry. They've made these really clear, nice pictograms for you. Some of the brokers have done their own versions of these pictograms. Just be sure to include it on your listing. MLS is working on, I think it's some sort of automatically included version of this, but it is not live yet, to my knowledge at least. So right now we're all responsible for including these in the listing. The easiest way to do it is to just do it in your pictures. Then you know people are seeing it. Let's be honest, people generally look at all the photos. They don't always read all the text.
Very true. Yeah, and this is something we touched on in the last presentation, but converting this into a picture, converting the pictogram into a picture and putting it in your MLS photos is probably the highest probability that somebody will see it method for distributing this information. And so we strongly encourage you to do that. If you need help converting these into the pictogram into pictures, I'm sure that we can help you with that, whether it's at somebody from the association, or feel free to reach out either to Marsha or I.
I actually have a version I did earlier this week. So if someone wants it, feel free to shoot over an email to myself, or we can even send it out, potentially try to get one attached to documents that get distributed. Okay. All right, let's talk a little bit about the plan and this listing agreement addendum amendment. So we went over this last time. We're going to hit a couple new points and just reiterate that when you have a listing that you're working on that's active, that you're on the, certainly that you're on the market, want to get this signed, takes the seller through all of the special considerations for the time we're living in and these extra rules that we now all have to comply with. In general, this agreement affirms that all visitors will sign the CAR PEAD-V. The broker promises to keep a copy of those and provide them to the seller if they request them. And this is the one that I know people are interested in, so we'll make sure to highlight it. Allows the listing agent and seller to agree that the seller will pay for the cost of compliance with the OSHA requirements. That includes purchasing hand sanitizer, cleaning costs, etc. As a part of this, and we covered this last time, but important to underscore, the sellers and the listing agent need to work together to decide what are going to be the qualification requirements for viewing this property in person. So the big ones generally include a pre-qual or proof of funds, signed acknowledgement that the prospective buyers reviewed all virtual media, and signed acknowledgement that they've received the disclosures and looked through those and potentially found any deal breakers. One note about the pre-qual, because I've been having a lot of conversations about that with people. You know, some people get squeamish because they think, oh, I don't want to show how much money I have. It's going to impact my ability to negotiate. You know, first of all, if you were submitting an offer, you would be showing some sort of proof of funds generally. But there are a lot of ways to handle this. If your client really is squeamish about it, call the lender and ask them for a pre-call letter that's literally the list price. And if you're talking to the listing agent, you can say, we have this produced, it's list price, my client's qualified. That should be adequate. But also remember, we work in a market where people often show proof of funds that far exceed what a property costs. So I think we've all seen situations where people have proof of funds that many millions of dollars more than a property costs. And the truth is, any buyer's going to pay what they're going to pay for a property. The fact that they can afford it just shows that they're a more qualified buyer, right?
Right.
All right, so couples, this is that listing agreement amendment addendum. And a few things we wanted to highlight specifically that I mentioned earlier. So 1B gives you the option to check the pre-qual or the financially able to purchase the property. So that's proof of funds or pre-qual. And then 3 is that they've reviewed all the virtual media. So those are options. Generally, it's a good idea right now, because if you've got a bunch of people coming to the property as a listing agent, you don't want to have to disinfect the property for someone who can't afford to buy the property. It's just not a good use of anybody's time.
Yeah, and I'll just point out also, this also gives the seller the ability to choose not to let people see the property, not to view the property, under 1A, and those 2 blue check marks that are listed for the PEAD-S and the mandatory government showing, the BPPP, are automatically pre-checked, and so those are a requirement if we're going to use the residential listing agreement coronavirus amendment or addendum. And a point, this can be used either at the time that you sign up the listing, or if at some point during the listing the seller decides that they want to amend the listing agreement and include specific terms or provisions related to showings around coronavirus.
All right. And then this is from paragraph 5, the other point that we mentioned specifically about the showing requirements, cleaning requirements, and then the showing requirement costs. So you see under B2 that you can check the box, seller agrees to pay for necessary supplies. So that's something that I'm sure we'll be seeing discussed more between sellers and listing agents. And then C2, you can check the box, broker and agent are authorized to hire in seller's name a service to clean and disinfect property. So discussions to have with your clients. And, this is sort of a new practice that we're all figuring out, but just remind your clients, sellers want their property to be safe. This is the law. We're all working together to figure out the most efficient and effective ways to accomplish that. All right. PEAD-S. Neil, you want to take us through this?
Sure. So the PEAD-S is going to be signed by sellers or possibly occupants of the property. Again, you're getting their affirmative consent to permit visits. They're going to promise to check themselves, do a home health screening, and report any symptoms that they have, either prior to your visiting of the property, or if they're, Marcia and I were talking about this before the start of this presentation, that if it's a vacant property where the seller's not going to the property on a regular basis, they're not living in the property, there's nobody living in the property, we can get this up front. And I believe there is space there for them to fill in that if there's a change, if they do visit the property and there's a change, or if they plan to change the property, that they'll update their property entry advisory and declaration for occupants. That's as opposed to a property where they are living in the property, or there's tenant occupied property where a tenant has consented to permit these sorts of showings. Those would want to be updated on a regular basis if there are multiple showing, different visitors, different days. There should be permutations of that should be taken into consideration so that we can have the most current information about their current COVID status.
That's exactly right. And then we have a couple visuals for you. We're not going to go through every line, but I think we've all seen this out there circulating. The section that Neil, just at the top here, seller occupant, that's what Neil was talking about. So could be a tenant. And then section 5 is where you would write in those additional terms. So if the seller is not living in the property and it's vacant, yet it's staged, they would just write in, you know, the property is currently vacant and staged. The last time the seller was at the property was approximately X date. If they return, you know, you write that out. It's sort of freehand, just to make it clear to anyone who's in the property that the seller is not going in and out of the property. And then you'll see these great little check boxes at the bottom here. So these give a little bit of flexibility to the form. We're going to see them on the PEAD-V again, in a little bit different layout, but it allows you to have multiple people sign this. So just, you can use it in different ways. You've got your acknowledgement initials on the bottom.
And just to make it clear, the acknowledgement portion is not a requirement for the form to be valid. It's there for convenience. You know, as a manager, I certainly would be sending this to our clients to have them acknowledge it. I would be acknowledging and I'd be asking for it as a best practice for practitioners to make sure that not only are these forms signed, but we're getting acknowledgement of the parties that they've received them.
That's right. All right, we got the PEAD-V. So this should be, as we mentioned earlier, provided by pretty much any visitor, including the agent who goes into the property. If you are the agent, you should be asking for this and providing a copy via digital signature platform to inspectors, other people coming in. If you've got a contractor coming in or somebody like a single person coming in to change out a light fixture, they've got to sign it. You know, it's anybody coming into the property. It's got to be provided every day the person enters the property, because keep in mind, what they're saying is that they're currently not experiencing these symptoms, but it also applies to a time period. So it is a moving schedule, if you will. You may include multiple addresses on here. So that's a question that comes up a lot. If you believe your client is seeing 2 properties on the same day, you could have them sign one form with multiple properties, addresses listed. Applies to all of them. You may or may not want to do that in terms of a disclosure, because you will be sending it to the other side. So if you're looking at multiple properties, I don't know strategically if that matters, but it does include signatures for parents and guardians. So we'll take a quick look at that. Neil referenced that earlier. It references that BPPP every time. Gets me every time. And it explicitly says that the visitor is promised to abide by the posted rules of entry, which is what we were just looking at with the pictogram, which will be on the door when you walk in or somewhere outside, right? So you can see it before you actually enter the property. And then in paragraph 8, much like with the PEAD-S, we have a space for additional information. So if your client, for example, works as a physician and interacts with patients who might have coronavirus, probably a good idea for them to say in the additional information, this is my occupation. I have no symptoms. I do not believe I'm currently afflicted. It's, you know, there's a logic there to making that disclosure, so everyone can make informed decisions. And then a quick look at the visual on this form. Looks relatively similar to the other form, gives more information about the rules, which we've gone through in detail. And then a couple specific things. Let's see. Oh, do I have, hold on, oh, I have the wrong, oh, that's a bummer. I have the wrong visual here, but the form has a couple different check boxes on the bottom, and it allows you to choose broker agent, other, I believe, prospective buyer. It allows you to choose who the signer is, and there are 3 lines there. So the concept behind this, pretty simple. You got 2 parties from the same group, right? From their same household plus an agent. They can all sign one form.
Mhm.
If there are minors, make sure they're listed under there. I apologize for this second page. It should be on here, but there isn't an area to list minors. You should be including them. Anything else on that, Neil?
No, I was going to say, you know, as we were looking at this, it occurred to me. So one of the changes that was incorporated in that very quick update was it used to be that the PEAD-S, the PEAD-V specifically only referenced the BPPP. But one of the nice things they did when they made this update on Tuesday was if your brokerage has its own plan, this PEAD is now compatible with that. I mean, certainly check with your risk manager, check with your manager to make sure that's the policy in your office. But that was a concern that many of the brokerages who had developed their own COVID prevention plans were voicing about the updated PEAD. And so that's why also one of the reasons that the signatures went away on the BPPP and clarification in the PEADs, PEAD-S and PEAD-V.
And one more thing to that point, Neil, that I think is great to bring up. I know Coldwell Banker has its own plan. I don't know, other brokerages may have their own plans. Make sure you get the actual plan from the listing agent. Don't assume just because we all think, oh, we all know the plans are, just read this one, and it applies to everything. You know, get the actual plan, follow the rules of that listing. I know it's a little bit more work, but that's part of the best practices here.
Agreed. And I don't think it's just Coldwell Banker that has their own plan. I know that there's several larger brokerages that develop plans. The important thing to understand is the rules that you are required to comply with are going to be summarized in the plan. And I can't imagine there's a huge amount of variation because they're still all looking at the OSHA requirements, the governor's orders, but some of the other plans may include some of those specific local requirements that are not necessarily found in the BPPP explicitly. They're incorporated by reference to check with your local ordinances.
All right. And finally, be mindful of your marketing. I know we've got a couple questions, I think. We'll get to those in a minute regarding open houses. Just like I said, SFAR's official stance on this is today, don't use the term open house, don't use the term broker tour. We understand there are opportunities for in-person showings when certain guidelines are followed. Let's all be respectful of that and not lose that opportunity that the city has afforded us in specific situations by trying to get clicks on an email. It's just not worth it. And then fair housing rules apply. So remember, if you guys agree as listing agent and the seller, these are the rules we're going to require: pre-qual or proof of funds, virtual materials. That gets applied across the board. There are no exceptions. There's no, oh, I like this agent, so they don't have to. Like, everybody needs to be treated exactly the same. So when those requirements are set, they apply to everyone.
Agreed. All right, let's take a look at the questions. Marcia, I will go ahead and read you the first question from Linda Kohler. For PEAD-Vs for entrants, just to confirm, no entrant can sign a paper copy that the agent has brought with them that has, and then in parens, that has not been at the house but in the agent's possession just prior to entering. If they give the entrant gloves prior to signing, would that work?
So it looks like this relates there. She's specifically concerned about the contractors, which I understand because it's the challenge. You know, the sort of the most conservative interpretation is that this isn't supposed to be happening at the property. So that is our understanding of how the law was written. I will say I heard some stories about people carrying PEADs and putting them outside and having people sign and then go into the property right away as buyers, which seems to be not following the spirit of the law. Neil, I mean, on a contractor note, Neil, do you have any remarks?
I do. So if you're dealing with a licensed contractor, OSHA governs their behavior too. And so if they have workers going in and they have their own plan for a work site that includes active health screening, wearing masks, appropriate social distancing, taking proper steps, they can provide you with a copy of that plan. They're assuming some amount of risk. Your seller is assuming some amount of risk in having those folks there, but you know, they're bound by many of the same requirements that we have. OSHA has published specific rules for real estate showings, which is what's incorporated into CARS documents, but the licensed contractor may have their own set of requirements. The concern is for those people that maybe aren't licensed, which we shouldn't be recommending that they do work, but the seller can elect to have whomever they want, assuming that they follow the own requirements under their homeowners insurance and local laws, state laws, perform work in their home. And those are the people in particular that we would be concerned about. They're not covered by somebody else's plan. And I would be asking them to sign off on a PEAD-V in advance. And I'd ask them, you know, again, taking the most conservative approach, to reaffirm that each day that they come back to the property.
All right. Christine, do you want to take this one? I saw that car forms no longer require gloves, but Dan Hirschquist told us that gloves are still required by SFAR. Can you please confirm? Well, I know this. SFAR's official stance is that gloves and booties should still be used, because I got that last week. So I would say do it.
Yeah, I don't have any secret insight here, to be honest. I'm not sure when Dan gave that advice. I do trust Dan. He does a lot of risk management, and certainly I don't think it's a bad idea to wear gloves. But whether or not San Francisco's ordinance specifically still requires gloves, I couldn't say.
All right. Can listing agents use the MLS open house space to advertise COVID compliant showings with 15-minute cleaning intervals? So what's tricky about the open house, the public open house area in MLS, is it populates to all of these other services. So if I open my Redfin app, what does it show me? It shows me the house is open from 2 to 4 today, the general public. And so at this stage, since open houses are not allowed at all, even with any additional by appointment open houses or anything using that language, I would highly discourage using the public open house space, for fear that it would create mass confusion and you'd have people showing up at the property.
Yeah, and I'll tag on to that. I know that the association is working on a way to utilize the open house and brokers tours features in a way that will be compliant with the requirements set forth in the local ordinances and the statewide requirements. But I don't, as far as I know, unless somebody knows something to the contrary, that those features are not up at present. And frankly, I think the intent that they're pursuing, you know, I'll speak a little bit inside, is they're really considering having virtual broker's tour, so that you could click on a link to virtually attend a broker's tour or to virtually attend an open house. So I think at this point that it would not be appropriate to use the MLS open house feature and still be in compliance with the current guidelines. And Helen asks where to find a copy of the recording for part 1. I'm sure that Jen will be very kind to include it in the email out of this recording so that people have easy access to it. And maybe even we can get it into the chat. That might be another way we can get it shared. But there was an email approximately 10 days ago that went out that has it from SFAR. So you should be able to find it there as well.
Okay. Diane asks, do I post or have an initial the new mandatory government showing document? I believe she's asking, do you post it at the property? And what you would be posting at the property is that car pictogram. Let me go back to it. So these documents you see are what CAR has put together to post at the property itself. And this mirrors the language that's in the BPPP that everyone's reviewing that's now attached to the PEAD-V. So anyone signing the PEAD-V would have this information through a different form, right? Because they're mirroring each other. But these two documents should be posted at the property.
And I'll point this out, if you work with a broker that has their own version of the plan, obviously check with your manager, check with your risk manager about whether or not you would be posting your own plan, this and your own plan, or just this, to get specific answers to that question. And then Seema asks, is this form just for realtors? I guess in context, I'm not sure which form you're referring to, but any of the forms that we've put up on the screen are California Association of Realtor forms. They are specifically available to realtors through zip forms or through the CAR website. So to answer your question, yes, they are for realtors. But if you're asking who needs to sign the PEAD-V or who needs to sign the PEAD-S, these are forms that should be provided to, again, any person who might be visiting the property or be residing in the property.
Okay. Holly asks, is it okay to ask for proof of funds on an apartment listing?
Is this a rental listing, or are we talking about the listing for sale of an apartment building? So I'll take the second part first, which is typically in a sale transaction, it's not uncommon to ask for a proof of funds. And if your seller client has instructed you to request proof of funds as a condition of an in-person showing, and you're applying that rule uniformly, then yes, asking for proof of funds is okay. With regards to a rental listing, is it okay to ask for proof of funds? Again, as long as the rule is applied uniformly, and that is a document that you might be asking for typically in a tenant screening process, I would think the answer is yes, it is okay to ask for proof of funds. But again, to be applied uniformly to anybody who's coming to visit the property.
All right. Christine, also understand from Dan, I'm assuming Hershkowitz, that was me saying that, that fair housing needs to apply among all listings an agent has. If one of an agent sellers requires it, that agent has to require it on all listings. So, if we have Dan on the line, I'd be curious to see him add something to our Q&A or to the chat line on this. It seems that if a broker has a lot of listings, do they all have to have the same rules? Why would there be something on the listing agreement amendment addendum that allows for a variable on that? But I am not an expert on fair housing law, so I'm going to defer this one.
Yeah, let's see if we can get a follow-up from Dan on that. I do a fair amount of fair housing education. I hadn't really considered that particular scenario. It seems to me that if a broker, and the broker is the one who has the listing, has multiple listings, that the standard would have to apply not just to the agent, but to all of the broker's listings. And that doesn't seem consistent with the ability of the seller to choose certain requirements. But we'll follow up with Dan and see if we can get a better answer on that.
Yep. Anonymous attendee. Does San Mateo County have similar rules? So we are not covering other counties today. So I noticed there may also be a Berries. Yep, we also have Berries question. Are there open houses with appointments allowed in Berries and Marin? We are not covering the other counties, so I would say check with your manager specifically about open house rules in different counties, since those are the more potentially more rigid local rules. I know there was some variability, but I do think Marin and San Francisco, I was going to say, I think San Francisco and Marin have been pretty aligned historically, but I would say talk to your risk manager or broker specifically about that area.
Yeah, I'm not sure about Marin, I'll be honest. But in San Mateo, the health department down there has been pretty consistent with whatever San Francisco has been putting forth. So I would assume the rules are at least as rigid, possibly even more.
Okay. Okay. Christine is asking for a fair housing update. I think that's a very good idea, and we will recommend that to education. And I think it's a very timely topic, so that would be great. In San Francisco, tenant occupied properties, if the landlord is also present, is he or she a visitor? So I guess my first question would be, why are so many people present? Would be my first question. Is there a way to limit the number of people present in a property during those showings?
Well, let's try and tease that question apart a little bit. So in a situation where you're showing a tenant occupied property, first of all, I want to point out that that is something that is, you want to be very careful about doing, obtaining the consent of the occupant, that they understand the potential risk, that they understand that they don't have to show the property for all intents and purposes. Yes, we know that there is civil code section that addresses whether or not the owner has the right to show property to prospective buyers. But of course, the courts are closed, so pursuing that is going to take a long time, and we would encourage you to consult with the appropriate qualified San Francisco tenant landlord attorney. But in a situation where a tenant and an agent do have the consent of the occupant to visit the property, if the question is whether or not the seller should be signing the PEAD-V or the PEAD-S, I don't actually have a strong opinion about that one way or the other. I'm going to go with both.
I think the larger point here, yes, is you want to make sure that there's a disclosure of the risk factor, but also them agreeing and attesting that they do not have symptoms.
Yeah. Anonymous attendee asks, where do we buy those blue booties? You know, I've seen them on Amazon. I've seen them in some of the hardware stores. I've also seen, the last meeting we had, somebody suggested that there's a sort of a catch-all store over on Clement Street called Kame that may have had them. You know, honestly, I don't know specifically where you can get them today. Your inventory may vary. In the past, we've suggested that you might be able to get them from title companies. I don't honestly know if title companies still have any. After our last suggestion, there was probably a run on them. But those are a few suggestions as to where you might look.
Well, and just a reminder too, you know, I always really like the hefty ones, the really heavy duty ones, because they're so nice normally, but we are disposing of these. So I was able to order some inexpensive ones on Amazon, just with the thought of, okay, these are all going to get thrown away after one use. So something to think about, but it was not hard to find them on Amazon. They came in a couple days. They were not expensive. Okay.
Yes, you can have an email of the presentation. I don't think that would be a problem.
Sure. And I will fix that one slide with the form so you have the
Get the
actual
signature
visual of that
blocks.
form.
Yeah.
Yep. Where will this recording and the previous one be available? So there is a website that has these posted, and Genevieve, who is helping us out today, is on the line, and I might ask her to, if she can unmute.
She already posted it.
Us.
Yeah, she posted it in the chat. So Genevieve, if you
Great.
want to unmute yourself, you can share.
Yeah, I posted it in the chat. It'll be uploaded hopefully by today. If not, definitely by Monday, on our SFAR social YouTube channel.
And that is the location where you'll find our previous presentation and lots of the other classes and presentations that have been given over the last, God, has it already been almost 3 months? Jen, how many programs have been put on? I'm sure you have a sense of that during the shelter-in-place period. The association's been doing a tremendous job.
Yeah, we've had, let me see. We've had 21 webinars since shelter in place, and almost 2,700 members have attended.
That's incredible. And let's just quickly skim. I'll skim the chat to see if we missed any.
Yeah,
questions.
I was just looking in
Okay.
there. Looks like people are hoping for a new MLS space to advertise the appropriate types of virtual showings. I agree. That would be fantastic.
The association is definitely working on it. It's it's hard to transition some of the technology very quickly, but we can obviously all see the value in having the ability to do virtual showings, whether in different formats, and having that available as a tool going forward. Because even though San Francisco might relax the showing requirements going forward, it doesn't really represent a return to the old way of doing business. And frankly, I don't, this is me, Neil, saying this, not the association. I don't see a return to that level of normalcy probably for at least until there's a widely available vaccine or some amount of immunity out there that would constitute people being willing to take that risk.
Yep, I think that's a fair point, and just we all need to be ready to pivot and be flexible. And I think our jobs have always required that, but I think in today's climate, it requires it in new and exciting ways.
Agreed. And I'm hoping that we won't have to do another big change to these forms in the near future, but as this evolves, Marcia and I will continue to be here and be a resource for all of you. I do want to stress that if there's questions about San Francisco specific forms, or even if there's just general questions about forms, you can always submit a request via email to forms@sfrealtors.com. And we will respond back. We try to be very diligent about that. We'll continue to put out educational materials to all of our members so that we can help you practice real estate in the safest way possible. Because at the end of the day, of course, we want to keep people safe, but we also want to help you make money. We understand that we're all trying to make a living, and we're all in this together.
All right. Thank you, everybody who attended and asked great questions. And thank you, Neil.
No, thank you, Marcia. And thank you, Jen. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jen.
Take care. Be safe out there.
Thank you.